So today, in teaching through the Bible, we're going to finish up this section on chapters 1 through 10 in this outline here. And this is when the first generation is preparing to enter the promised land. They're getting prepared. We've had the census. We talked last time about chapters 5 and 6, about why we have this Nazirite vow, why we have this test for adultery, all of that in our last video. But here we've got chapter 7 through 10. Chapter 7, it seems really repetitive, but now we're going to address that and see what's actually going on here and how important is it really. It's talking about sacrifices that the leaders of each tribe sacrificed. A very long chapter, and it's very easy to just read over this and just kind of pass over it. It's not a lot there. It's easy to think that. But if we do that, we do miss things. I've said last video, it's good to always see what's the, which 12 tribes is it? Because you can actually name 13, but there's always 12. So which 12 tribes is it? Why is it those 12? Why is it that order? You can see a few other things. You see this isn't chronological. Chapter 7, on the day when Moses had finished setting up the tabernacle. So that, we know from Exodus, from the very end of Exodus, when he did that was actually before what happens in Numbers chapters 1 through 6. So Numbers 1 through 6, we saw we flip back to Numbers chapter 1, that was in the second year, on the second month. Whereas the tabernacle was set up before that. On the first day of the second month in the second year. That's what chapter 1 says. So this is chronologically after chapters 7 through 9, as we're going to see. But that's okay. There's no problem with that. We just need to acknowledge and understand, okay, these aren't all chronological. And we talked about that way back in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, and how that's not, chapter 2 isn't chronologically after chapter 1. You can go back and check those videos out. But the Bible isn't always in chronological order. And not every book is, and not every chapter in every book is. And there's nothing in the Bible that says it needs to be. It doesn't make it less true to have things not being in chronological order. It can be in thematic order. It can be in other kinds of structure. So it doesn't mean it's not structured. It doesn't mean it's not accurate just because the order is different than chronological. There's some other really important stuff here that if you look and say, you know what, this just seems like it's just really repetitive. I don't really have time for it. I'll just kind of skim through it. It's, I'm sure it's the Bible, but this is not the most important part. It's, kind of lower on the scale of importance. But, King David would say, hold up, wait a second here. Actually, you know what? That's what I thought, and I was wrong. Because in here, we see something that David obviously skipped over, because the kings of Israel were supposed to be copying down and writing and paying attention to God's word, specifically this part of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And in here, it says that 2 of the 3 groups of Levites got carts to put supplies in, the things that they were supposed to be moving, parts of the tabernacle. They were supposed to be moving that. That was part of their job. It says in verse 9, so chapter 7, verse 9, but to the sons of Kohath he gave none, because they were charged with the service of the holy things that had to be carried on the shoulder, like the Ark of the Covenant. So when the Ark of the Covenant gets moved later on in the Bible, it's in the Promised Land, it gets moved to Jerusalem, and David says, bring this to Jerusalem. Guess what? They put it in a cart. They didn't carry it the proper way that this says, and someone died because of that. So it's really important to pay attention to the details. And here's one example right here. The last thing I'll note here before we wrap up is this is pretty standard as far as the way this is written for documents of that day. And so the fact that it does this just shows, it's just more evidence of the historicity of this document, that this document was not written way later. Basically, they just say that Bible was kind of added together bit by bit later on, maybe in King Josiah's day. They put it together or something. But here we have a document that is using what was common at the time that it's claimed to have been written. And we even have the blessing, Aaron's blessing. That was written down, and we found it on these silver scroll, tiny silver scrolls. There's two of them that were in these tombs that dated from hundreds of years before that part of the Bible was supposedly written. So we see here that in this part of the book of Numbers, we get more evidence of this being historically accurate, of this not being something that was just kind of cobbled together later. It has structure, it has purpose, it fits the time period, and even shown to have been in existence before the people who don't believe it actually say it existed. Chapter 8, we're looking at the very beginning, something that may seem a little out of place here, probably does. This happens a number of times in the Bible where we see something that just seems like, why is it here? And really, there's an answer. Sometimes we don't know what it is. Sometimes later on we figure out what it is. Maybe some of these things we'll never quite know until we get to heaven, and then it'll become clear. But chapter 8, just the first few verses. Now Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and say to him, when you set up the lamps, the 7 lamps shall give light in front of the lampstand." And Aaron did so. And so this light was shining then on the tabernacle's bread loaves. There was 12 loaves of bread on the table. They were kind of on opposite sides. There was the lampstand, and there was the table that had bread. And this represented God's light shining on his people, the 12 tribes of Israel. But so why is this here? Well, what do we just have? Census, right? Very beginning of the book. Their whole system of where they were supposed to be around the tabernacle, how they were supposed to march out, all these instructions for them. Then we had the Levites. And here's your different census and your different responsibilities. Then we have just had here these sacrifices, what was expected of these 12 tribes, of all the tribes except for Levi. But then the Levites, guess what they had to do? The priests of the tribe of Levi, specifically, they needed to keep the lampstand burning. They actually went in every day, actually. Twice a day, they go in and light this, and or keep it lit, rather. That it was not to ever go out. It was supposed to always be shining, and shining on the 12 loaves of bread. And so that was their job. As the rest of the tribes are doing what they're supposed to do, what's expected of them, the priests, what is expected of them? They are the in-between. They're the mediators between God and his people, between God and the 12 tribes. They're the ones through which God's light comes to the 12 tribes. And so this kind of just fits in nicely right after what the other tribes have just done. So we had the census of the tribes minus Levi, and then we had the census of Levi, and we had what those 12 tribes were doing and what the last tribe here, Levi, specifically the priests within the Levites, were doing. Wrapping up, it's kind of like the end of what we just saw in chapter 7. And then we get the cleansing of these Levites. We get the retirement in chapter 8, finishing up all the rest of that chapter. Well, what's going on in this chapter? Why do we have these sorts of things? Well, there's one really important thing to notice here as far as these preparations, as they're getting the Levites ready to serve, and then saying this is how you serve, this is when you're done serving, that they are essentially an offering to God. It calls them a wave offering here. It says that there are other offerings offered of animals, which are put on the altar, but the Levites are also, they're called a wave offering, and we have the Israelites go and place their hands on the Levites, right? It says, chapter 8, verse 10, "When you bring the Levites before Yahweh, the people of Israel shall lay their hands on the Levites, and Aaron shall offer the Levites before Yahweh as a wave offering from the people of Israel, that they may do the service of Yahweh." So these Levites, why are people putting their hands on them? Well, when you had an Israelite bring an offering of perhaps like a cow, or it could have been a sheep, could have been a goat. When they bring their offerings, they have to place their hand on the offering right? We saw this at the beginning of Leviticus. When you have like a sin offering, you're placing your hand on the offering, and that is conveying this unity between you and that. Like, I am essentially placing my sin. This is taking my place and being sacrificed on my behalf. That's what that's for. And well, now we're seeing this again, but it's with the Levites as the sacrifice. But of course, we see here they're not actually literally killed. They are dedicated fully to the service of the temple, or in this case, the tabernacle. So they are an offering that is totally dedicated and is not destroyed. And that'll be very important later on in the Bible. We actually see this referenced in a way in Romans chapter 12. It's verse 1 and verse 2. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. So there is a way of being totally dedicated to God and being an offering to God, but not dying, not physically dying right there, right? So that's that. We see that here. We see that in Romans. That's going to play an important part in some other stuff in between there. But that's just something to note, just right off the bat right here. The cleansing of the Levites, they are a type of offering. One other thing that we can notice here, people will point out that here it says in chapter 8, verse 23, and Yahweh spoke to Moses saying, this applies to the Levites from 25 years old and upward. They shall come to do duty in the service of the tent of meeting. But earlier, chronologically later, because remember this was a month before what we read earlier. Earlier, we saw that it was actually at 30 years old that they began their work. So why is it here say 25? One idea of this is that perhaps they started in training or maybe did certain jobs and then became full participants at the age of 30. Now, we don't know that that's the case, but that is a possibility. And so the fact that we even have an argument for what it could have been, even if it wasn't that particular thing, it shows that there can be a reasonable explanation as to why you have these two different numbers. So this is not something to be bothered about. One way or another, it doesn't matter which reason it is. The fact is there are possibilities as to what that could be. So this is not something to really be concerned about as far as having varying numbers, 25 and 30. But then we move on to chapter 9, and we see the Passover again. Now, Passover, we talked about that way back in Exodus. I'll put a link in the video below. Passover is explained. That's how it started back in Exodus. And so now they're having the next one. So this is a year later. They're having the second Passover. And some people aren't able to participate because they are unclean at the time. And God gives them, hey, okay, here's an exception and here's how you can handle it. And so this is wonderful that God gives them this exception. He says he's accommodating them in this way. And so that's a cool thing to see how God does have stipulations. He does have rules. But sometimes in some of these cases, he does have ways where, okay, in this case, you can do it this way instead. And we've seen this with the poor in the sacrifices back in Leviticus. Well, if you're poor, then you can just give this kind of sacrifice sometimes instead of that kind of sacrifice. That's not always the case, but he does have sometimes where there are these exceptions. And he has one here for certain people. You can do the Passover a month later. And then a few days after that, after this month later time, that's when they're headed out. So we see that here in these chapters, that it was only a few days after their kind of redo Passover that some people participated in, that they head out to the Promised Land. And when we see this, we see the silver trumpets. Why is this here? Well, this is part of the final preparations. They're getting ready. They got to have all the logistics set, and they need to know how to communicating. They have this is a huge number of people. It says here 603,000 fighting age men, right? Of that first census. This is an enormous group of people. This is the whole nation. They don't have a megaphone. They don't have radios. They don't have cell phones, but they have these trumpets to communicate to them different instructions. And so that's placed in here. But it also points us forward to, surprise, surprise, Jesus. These people, God's people, are communicated to through trumpets. And we see later on in the New Testament, talks about Jesus coming with the sound of a trumpet. It actually references that a few different times in the New Testament. I think 1 Corinthians would be one example. It actually references that a few different times. It talks about how when Jesus returns, so he came the first time and during the Gospels, and that talks about that time, but when he returns, it's with the sound of a trumpet. And so you kind of see here Jesus communicating to his people through the trumpets, and that will happen again in a greater way at his return. So we have these trumpets that are communicating to God's people and instructing them in what they're to do. Before finally it says in verse 11, chapter 10, verse 11, in the second year, in the second month, on the 20th day of the month, the cloud lifted from over the tabernacle of the testimony, and the people of Israel set out by stages from the wilderness of Sinai. So they're finally actually headed from the mountain to the promised land. They're finally on their way. They've done all this preparation. They've got everything ready. They've got all the stipulations. They've got everything taken care of. It's ready. It's time. And that's super exciting. It's an amazing thing for them that they get to progress on their journey now. They made it from Egypt to Mount Sinai. Now they're going from there to the land. We do see a little note here that Moses gets his brother-in-law to come along. And his brother-in-law initially was like, I'm going to stay with my family. And Moses says, hey, God's going to bless us. Be part of this blessing. Something interesting that we can note here is how this guy's related to Moses. He's related to the prophet, right? This is the primary prophet in the history of the Israelites. Later on, we'll see that there's a promise. There will be a prophet like Moses coming later. It's talking about Jesus. There's all these other prophets that come after Moses. None of them is that guy, right? So Moses is the guy. He is this paradigmatic Savior in the Old Testament of God's people. And he says, like he's talking to his brother-in-law. He doesn't say, you're my brother-in-law, your family, you're in. The familial relation, it doesn't matter. That doesn't get the blessing. It's not about, I'm related to that guy. Right? And we saw this in, actually, if you go look in, especially Gospel according to John in the New Testament, then when Jesus is talking with the Pharisees, they say, we're pretty much good to go because we're related to Abraham. They base it on this familial relation. But here we see that's not how God works. God works in his covenant community, and Moses says, come be with this group, with God's people. And being with God's people, that's how you'll get blessing. So good to see this spiritual connection versus this familial connection. It is how the blessing comes. Good to be able to get a picture of that right here as they're about to head off, unfortunately to fail. We'll get to that in the next videos. Thank you for watching that video. I hope that it helped you learn a little bit more about the Bible today. And if you'd like to continue to learn more about the Bible, then we have plenty of other videos on the channel. And if this has been helpful for you, then you can always let me know by subscribing to the channel. And hopefully I'll be able to continue to help you learn even more about God's Word. Thanks.